Okay, so now I'm going to start the video trailer of the book. It's about 1 minute long, then I'll come back and start the presentation. Okay, so 1 second, get rid of this. Okay, as the title indicates, um, that clip, of course, was about Jim Crow and some of the highlights in the book. And this morning, I'm going to talk about Jim Crow then versus now. Can it happen again? And in order to answer that question, I've chosen a excerpt from my book, and the excerpt from the book is titled "Living Under Jim Crow: Its Impact." As you all know, although slavery ended in the United States in 1863, former slaves really were still not truly free. And this is true because very soon after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Southern Confederate states passed laws to institute slavery all over again. But at the individual state level, these laws were called the Black Codes. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Black Codes. So not much had actually changed for most slaves during this period. But because of the Black Codes that the states had implemented to take away the rights given to freed slaves by Emancipation Proclamation, which was passed in 1863, which was signed, I should say, by President Lincoln in 1863, the United States Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. And I do mean that the states had taken away the slaves' freedom. And I'll give an example of that. I'm not going to pick on North Carolina, but it is where I was born and raised. And a majority of the book, when I talk about Jim Crow, I'm talking about, for the most part, experiences that I had in North Carolina. So I'm going to identify one of the Jim Crow laws, or talk about one of the Jim Crow laws in the North Carolina Constitution, specifically Section 2. And this particular section of the North Carolina law described the law's purpose as making freed slaves subject to the same laws they were subject to before emancipation. And those laws, of course, before emancipation were slavery. And I'm going to cite an excerpt from one of the North Carolina's Black Codes and pay attention particularly to Section 1. And I'll start here with Section 1, because what Section 1 does is basically describe and identify who would be impacted by this law. Be it enacted by the General Assembly of the state of North Carolina that Negroes and their issue, even where one ancestor in each succeeding generation to the fourth, inclusive, is white, shall be deemed persons of color. So going back to the fourth generation, any mixed blood person was considered a person of color. and would be impacted by this law. Now, Section 2, which I'm about to read now, actually took away those rights. All persons of color who are now inhabitants of this state shall be entitled to the same privileges and are subject to the same burdens and disabilities as by the laws of the state were conferred on or were attached to free persons of color prior to the ordinance of emancipation, except as the same may be changed by law. So Section 2 is important, of course, because it applies to all enslaved people who had been freed in 1863 by the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But this new law, enacted at the local and state level in North Carolina, now took away those rights from all free persons of color and returned them back to the laws they had been subject to prior to their freedom. This meant that their rights had been restored legally back to a condition of slavery in North Carolina, even though the Emancipation Proclamation had freed them. During the Reconstruction period, Congress passed the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments. These amendments to the Constitution were called the Reconstruction Amendments. And of course, there were some other laws that were also passed that were all during that period that are considered Reconstruction laws. But they were called Reconstruction Amendments because they ended slavery, guaranteed citizenship for all formerly enslaved people, including those in North Carolina, and the 15th Amendment gave male slaves the right to vote. Now, this amendment was ratified in 1870 by Congress. So even though slaves got the right to vote in 1870, they still could not exercise those rights completely free of intimidation until almost 95 years later with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Because instantly after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave them the right to vote, the amendment to the Constitution in North Carolina and most other southern states, free former slaves and white Republicans then formed voting coalitions. And overnight, they changed the politics and the balance of power at the local, state, and the federal levels. But this condition was short-lived because Reconstruction was actually over by around 1876, just about 6 years after it had started. And it ended because of conservative Democrats and ex-Confederates attacks. They were taking place all throughout the South. So white supremacy was starting to take hold, and particularly in North Carolina. The white supremacy campaign in North Carolina greatly impacted the political progress of blacks in the states. So because of some state laws that were passed by the white Republicans, they were able to slow the impact down. And as a result, in the 1898 state election, as many as 80% of eligible black voters participated in the state election. Can you imagine that? 80% of eligible voters, African-American males, participated. But this caused the Democratic Party to speed up its white supremacy campaign by targeting black voters. And the effort was very similar to what we see in modern day, the modern day Republican Party, doing across the country with voter suppression and other tactics that's used. Only then it was much more intense and extremely violent. So based on all the negative activity we see today is what makes it so important to raise this question now. Can it happen again? Now, during this period, the News and Observer newspaper sponsored regular addresses as part of the attacks and newspaper articles appealing to white voters about Negro domination. The intent was to place fear into the hearts of the people. So black men, they talked about black men raping white women and other fear-mongering. It was very much like what is done by some Republicans today when they degrade African-American voters in states where there are significant numbers of people of color residing by accusing them of cheating and so forth. Or it's like the president, current president, turning white supremacists out of jail to target those who oppose him. And the president tweeting nasty, mean, and demeaning things about most black people in public office. And much like him tweeting to praise white supremacy. The tactics are the same, but just different methods and different times. The Democrats in North Carolina during that period even advised a plan to attack, and this is really important, the city of Wilmington if blacks were to be successful in keeping control of the local government in Wilmington in the 1898 election. Because Wilmington then was the most populated city in the state, and it had a sizable black population and a black newspaper. Consequently, the newspaper editor responded to the racist newspaper articles by the News and Observer calling black men rapists. They responded through news articles accusing white women of initiating the sexual contact. This angered white conservative Democrats greatly. And as a result of it, the white supremacy campaign of Democrats was very successful and resulted in the party winning the overwhelming share of the districts across the entire state. But in Wilmington, in the 1898 election, black and Republicans combined to control all local Wilmington elected offices. In response to white Republicans and recently freed blacks' success in Wilmington in the local election, the white supremacists on August 10, 1898, attacked and they burned the office of the black newspaper, the Daily Record. The attack resulted in the killing of 36 blacks. All of the elected officials were forced at gunpoint to resign and were run out of town. And then Democrats filled all of the local government positions with hand-picked white supremacists. This event placed fear into the hearts of African Americans in North Carolina and would prove to impact voter participation for years to come, especially since both the federal and the state government stood by and watched this happen with no intervention at all. It didn't just all take place in one day. But during the period that it was taking place, neither the state nor the federal government intervened. The name of this event has been called the Wilmington Insurrection. So they then pursued implementing a white supremacist agenda across the state, which they were very successful in doing so. But this marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era in North Carolina and led to the implementation of white supremacist laws and amendments to the state constitution, which established laws such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and a complete disenfranchisement of black voters. These laws still existed when I grew up in North Carolina. So when I was a teenager, these laws were still on the books and they were enforced. That is the reason I say I grew up under Jim Crow. Legally speaking, segregation ended with the passage of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1964, legally. But several Jim Crow laws still existed and were enforced, and they remained in place until Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1966. Even with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1966, segregation still remained, and it's still very prevalent. For example, when I graduated from high school in 1968, Pitt County schools still had not been desegregated. Just think about it. Congress had already passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, And 102 years later, we still do not have full rights as citizens. And 102 years later, again, it had not materialized. And shockingly, some traces of Jim Crow laws are still present in the North Carolina Constitution. Even today, when I wrote this book, now I haven't checked today, but in 2020, when I wrote this book, there was a literacy law still on the books. To be more specific about that, the literacy requirement for voting was placed there in the North Carolina Constitution in the 1900s. And as I said earlier, it was placed there to deter Black men's voter participation because 2 years after the North Carolina election of 1898, 80% of eligible Black voters participated in the election. It's still there and has been there for 120 years. And it's my understanding that there have been, well, first of all, you can read it, the literacy requirement law in Section 4 of Article 6 of the North Carolina Constitution. It states, I'm going to read it. Every person presenting himself for registration shall be able to read and write at any section of the Constitution in the English language. This literacy requirement is an example of just one of the Jim Crow laws and how it kept Black men from voting during this period. Because most Black men could not read and write, but neither could most white men. But they were required to be able to read and write the Constitution, in some cases, the Constitution. So in recent years, there have been some efforts to repeal the law and remove it, but it's been rejected. So that tells us a lot about where we are today. And I'm sure that there are other states whereby there is some trace of the remnant of Jim Crow in its Constitution, not just North Carolina. But the important point to be made here is that today we see the same toxic atmosphere across this country that existed in the 1900s when the state legislature passed that law. So many states, as you know, have passed anti-voting laws, and the process is still on the rise. The current administration, for example, is in the process of utilizing executive orders to dismantle all of the civil rights laws passed during our lifetime with the intent of taking away rights and or hindering any upward mobility of African Americans. Some states have even passed laws to ban books by Black authors in an effort to hide the truth about American history. And another important point to be made here is that unlike many elected officials, now I made this comment in my book that unlike many elected officials who support these efforts, that most citizens today do not support that attitude. Now, I have to modify that because there's evidence through polling and if we look at the recent election that that is no longer true. Most Americans today do support that same attitude that elected officials have been supporting. And that's unfortunate. But in order to maintain a democracy in this country, all citizens have a responsibility to speak out against political activities such as the anti-voting laws that we see being passed across the country. That's part of what a democracy is. And some of us even claim to be Christians. And if you're a Christian, it is not only your responsibility as a citizen of the United States or of your state under the Constitution of the area that you live in, but it is also your Christian responsibility to speak out against oppression, discrimination, and injustice. But both the New and the Old Testaments confirm this. So the conditions are ripe today to see another level of Jim Crow that will resist or that will restrict the rights of African Americans and other people of color in the United States. I mean, it's very ripe. So the question today in 2025 is not if it will happen again, but is what will you do, especially if you're a Christian, to stop the escalation to Jim Crow 2.0. I'm happy to take any questions or any comments. Hello, that ends my presentation.
Thank you, Lester. I appreciate
Sure.
that. Great comments and kind of helps us put into perspective where we are. And I mean, in many of the laws on the books now, there's many laws, especially in North Carolina, that should be changed. I mean, considering the times, and you suggested that there have been an attempt, but they were not able to, to make the adjustments that way. So, as a matter of fact, there's a book, there's a law in the book in the county, Wilson County, North Carolina, where in courts you are forbidden for chewing gum, or you cannot wear your shirt tails out of your pants, and you could be charged in court. And so, I mean, I think that there's some active engagement that we all need to share, and some work that we could all probably do, uh, and uh, and and that kind of thing. So, are there any other questions for Patrick? But what he said, and what we also should engage in, we need to make it clear that today, going forward, this is a new time. We need to be aware. Ignorance is no excuse. In fact, the suggestion is ignorance of the law is no defense. If you don't know a law exists or not, it's still no defense. I mean, we should carry ourselves from the standpoint of also being informed, talking, discussing relevant centers like this that you can refer to, and knowing, and also referring to people that should know, and becoming a part of membership groups about your knowledge, what you know about the law. And now, it doesn't mean that everybody should be a walking encyclopedia for the law, but it does mean that you need to know, have some, capacity for what's legal. Now in the popular life, people know what drugs are legal and what are not. You know, I mean, you know how to obey the traffic laws, but it's also important that you need to know relevant laws according to what you can be, accused of. So
I,
I thank you, Patrick. I really appreciate your insight. And if you would spend more time, man, we could always use your added insight on understanding. Now, as laws are, the states are different. Each state law is a different policy, even when it comes to finance, even when it comes to banking. Those are relevant conditions. Matter of fact, there could be laws on the books today that could transform your wealth into a prosperous run because of what the law suggests and say. So I'll just leave you here. Are there any other questions? Any other questions? Okay. Thank you. Give Patrick a round of applause. Now, I want to thank all of you for being online with us here, because there's a lot that we're going to try to include today. Now, I know we've had some good speakers, and we're primarily focused on business. And I want to reach out and say something kind and favorable for our good friend Joy Reid. Joy Reid, as you know, she just left MSNBC. Now, Joy is an amazing journalist. She is amazing, and I don't know, she'll land on her feet even her leaving MSNBC. and Martin, Roland Martin, of course, he has his own network channel. And she probably, I'm suggesting she needs to be in a more permanent condition where she can own her own network and own relevance knowledge because she still researches. Because the heart of a good journalist is research, research. So a couple things as we spread out. Mr. White, did you get your speaking, your
I have
speaker
to
set
stop
up?
recording and start
Okay,
again.
that's fine.
All
Okay,
right.
hold on.
Let me- Can you hear me now? You can't hear me at all?
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, okay.
Okay, very good. Proceed. You have the floor, Mr. Al
One
White.
sec, I have to stop and start again.
Okay, please.
Don't
Okay.
forget to subscribe.
Okay.